Sarah Martinez never imagined that cutting hair would save lives. The 28-year-old Barber from Texas had joined the military support staff, thinking she would spend her deployment giving simple haircuts to soldiers at a remote forward operating base in Afghanistan. Her small wooden barber shop sat at the edge of Camp Wilson, a tiny outpost nestled between rocky hills and desert valleys. The camp housed only 43 people, mostly support staff and a small SEAL team conducting reconnaissance missions in the surrounding area. Sarah had been there for 6 months, and her little shop had become a gathering place where soldiers could relax and forget about the dangers outside the wire for a few minutes. Every morning, Sarah would arrive at her shop before dawn, sweeping the floor and organizing her tools. The familiar routine of setting up scissors, razors, and towels gave her comfort in this strange place so far from home. She had learned to cut hair from her grandfather, who ran a barbershop in San Antonio for 40 years. He always told her that a good barber listens more than they talk, and Sarah had become an expert listener. The SEAL team would often stop by her shop after returning from their night missions. They were tired, dusty, and grateful for a moment of normal life. Sarah learned their names, heard about their families back home, and watched them unwind as she worked. Team leader Lieutenant Commander Jake Thompson was always polite and respectful. His team included 6 other highly trained operators who had been working together for 3 years. On this particular Tuesday morning in September, Sarah noticed something different in the air. The soldiers seemed more tense than usual, and radio chatter had increased dramatically overnight. Intelligence reports suggested unusual movement in the surrounding hills, but nobody expected what was about to unfold. As Sarah prepared for another routine day of haircuts and conversation, she had no idea that her small barbershop would soon become the center of a life-or-death struggle. The skills her grandfather had taught her about staying calm under pressure and thinking quickly would be tested in ways she never imagined. The quiet morning routine she cherished was about to be shattered by gunfire and explosions. Lieutenant Commander Thompson's team was preparing for what seemed like a standard reconnaissance mission. They had been tracking suspicious activity near a village 12 miles from camp, and Command wanted them to gather intelligence on potential threats. The mission briefing indicated light resistance, maybe a few scattered fighters at most. Nobody expected to encounter a coordinated force of 72 hostile fighters who had been planning an ambush for weeks. Sarah was finishing her morning setup when she heard the first helicopters taking off. Through her small window, she watched the SEAL team boarding their transport, their faces focused and professional as always. Thompson gave her a quick wave before climbing aboard. Not knowing this mission would test every skill they had learned, the helicopters disappeared over the eastern hills as the sun climbed higher in the desert sky. Sarah began her day as usual, giving haircuts to mechanics and supply clerks who appreciated her steady hands and friendly conversation. She had no way of knowing that 12 miles away, Thompson's team was walking into a carefully planned trap that would change everything. By noon, radio communications from the SEAL team had become sporadic. The operations center was trying to maintain contact, but something was interfering with their signals. Sarah continued working, occasionally glancing toward the radio room where officers were speaking in urgent, hushed tones. The atmosphere at camp was becoming increasingly tense, though nobody was sharing specific details about what was happening in the field. As afternoon approached, Sarah realized that this was not going to be just another ordinary day at Camp Wilson. The pieces were already in motion for a crisis that would push everyone to their absolute limits. The emergency call came through at 3:47 p.m. Sarah was trimming the hair of a young supply sergeant when sirens began wailing across Camp Wilson. Through the static-filled radio in her shop, she heard fragments of urgent communications. The SEAL team was in trouble, surrounded and requesting immediate extraction. Lieutenant Commander Thompson's voice crackled through the radio waves, tense but controlled. His team had walked into a perfectly orchestrated ambush while investigating what they thought was a small weapons cache. 72 enemy fighters had surrounded them in a narrow valley, using the rocky terrain to their advantage. The SEALs were pinned down behind a cluster of large boulders, running low on ammunition and with limited options for escape. Sarah's customer jumped up from the chair, only half his haircut complete, and ran toward the operations center. Within minutes, the entire camp was mobilizing for an emergency rescue mission. Sarah watched through her window as soldiers loaded equipment, checked weapons, and prepared vehicles. The urgency was unlike anything she had experienced during her deployment. The problem became clear quickly. The SEAL team was trapped in terrain that made helicopter extraction extremely dangerous. The narrow valley was surrounded by high ridges where enemy fighters had positioned heavy weapons. 2 rescue attempts had already been turned back by intense ground fire. The weather was deteriorating, with sandstorms moving in from the west that would make flying nearly impossible after sunset. Sarah closed her barber shop and joined the crowd gathering around the operations center. Camp Wilson's commanding officer, Colonel Patricia Hayes, was coordinating rescue efforts from multiple directions. Air support was limited due to the terrain and weather conditions. Ground forces would take hours to reach the trapped team, and time was running out rapidly. As evening approached, the situation became increasingly desperate. Thompson's team reported that enemy fighters were moving closer, tightening the circle around their position. They had managed to call in 1 successful airstrike, but it only bought them temporary breathing room. The hostiles were patient and well organized, clearly planning to wait until darkness before launching their final assault. Sarah found herself thinking about the conversations she had shared with these men in her barber shop. Thompson had shown her pictures of his 2 young daughters back in Virginia. Sergeant Rodriguez had talked about his upcoming wedding to his college girlfriend. Petty Officer Williams was planning to start law school after his military service ended. These were not just soldiers to her anymore. They were friends whose lives hung in the balance. The radio communications painted a grim picture. Thompson's team was conserving ammunition, using single shots instead of automatic fire. They had 2 wounded men who needed medical attention, but could not be evacuated under the current circumstances. The enemy fighters were methodically moving equipment into position for what appeared to be a coordinated night attack. At 7:30 p.m., Colonel Hayes made an announcement that sent chills through everyone at Camp Wilson. All available rescue aircraft had been grounded due to the approaching sandstorm. The weather would not clear until tomorrow morning at the earliest. Thompson's team would have to survive the night on their own, outnumbered 10-1, with limited supplies and no possibility of reinforcement until dawn. Sarah returned to her barber shop as darkness fell over the camp. She could not sleep, could not eat, could not concentrate on anything except the voices coming through the radio. Every few minutes, Thompson would check in with a brief status report. His team was still holding their position, but everyone knew the real test would come when the enemy fighters launched their assault under cover of darkness. The night stretched ahead endlessly, filled with uncertainty and fear. Sarah realized that her quiet life as a camp barber was about to intersect with a desperate battle for survival, in ways she never could have imagined. At 11:45 p.m., everything changed. Sarah was in her barber shop, unable to sleep and listening to radio updates, when she heard Colonel Hayes making an urgent announcement. A massive sandstorm had damaged the main communications array at Camp Wilson. Their primary radio system was down, and backup communications were severely limited. The camp had lost contact with higher command and could no longer coordinate rescue efforts effectively. But Sarah discovered something extraordinary in her small barber shop. Her grandfather's old shortwave radio, which she had brought from home for entertainment, was still working perfectly. The vintage equipment was unaffected by the electronic interference that had crippled the camp's modern systems. More importantly, she realized she could hear Thompson's team clearly on an emergency frequency they were using for backup communications. Sarah ran to the operations center, carrying her grandfather's radio. Colonel Hayes and her staff were struggling with damaged equipment and poor signal quality. When Sarah demonstrated that her radio could maintain clear contact with the trapped SEAL team, she suddenly became the most important person at Camp Wilson. She was now the primary communications link between the rescue coordinators and the men fighting for their lives 12 miles away. The responsibility was overwhelming. Sarah had never been trained for military communications, but she found herself relaying critical information between Thompson's team and the rescue commanders. Every word mattered. Every message could mean the difference between life and death for 7 brave men surrounded by hostile fighters in a remote valley. Thompson's situation was becoming increasingly desperate. His team reported movement all around their position as enemy fighters prepared for their assault. They had used most of their ammunition during the day and were down to their last few magazines. The 2 wounded men were stable, but needed medical attention soon. Most critically, they estimated they had maybe 2 hours before the hostiles would launch their coordinated attack. Sarah found herself becoming more than just a radio operator. Thompson began asking her to help coordinate details about potential escape routes, supply drops, and tactical information. Her calm voice and clear communication became a lifeline for the trapped team. She had never received military training, but her grandfather's lessons about staying calm under pressure were serving her well in this life-or-death situation. The camp's rescue teams were working frantically to develop new options. The sandstorm was expected to clear before dawn, which would allow helicopters to fly again. But Thompson's team needed to survive the next 6 hours first. Colonel Hayes was exploring the possibility of a dangerous night ground mission, but it would take time to organize and execute properly. As midnight approached, Sarah realized that her role was expanding beyond simple communication. Thompson was asking her to help analyze maps, coordinate timing for potential rescue attempts, and even provide tactical advice based on information she was receiving from multiple sources. Her barber shop had become an unofficial command center, with officers coming and going as they planned desperate rescue scenarios. The old shortwave radio crackled with Thompson's voice every few minutes. He was maintaining discipline and morale among his team, but Sarah could hear the strain in his words. These highly trained operators were facing the fight of their lives, and everyone knew that sunrise might come too late. The enemy fighters were patient and methodical, clearly planning to overwhelm the SEALs' position with superior numbers and firepower. Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She volunteered to maintain communications throughout the entire night, becoming the constant voice of support and connection for Thompson's isolated team. Her barber shop would remain operational as the primary communications hub until rescue operations could resume at dawn. She had no military training, but she had something equally valuable: the determination to help save the lives of men she considered friends. The attack began at 2:17 a.m. with a thunderous explosion that shook the ground 12 miles away. Sarah heard it clearly through her radio as Thompson's calm voice reported that enemy fighters were launching their assault. Rocket-propelled grenades were slamming into the rocks around the SEALs' position, followed by intense automatic weapons fire from multiple directions. Sarah's barbershop had become the nerve center for the rescue operation. Colonel Hayes and her staff were crowded around the vintage shortwave radio, listening to Thompson's tactical updates and trying to coordinate support from their limited resources. Sarah found herself directly communicating with the SEAL team leader, relaying information and providing crucial coordination between the trapped operators and their potential rescuers. The battle was intense and chaotic. Thompson reported that his team was returning fire from 3 different positions, trying to prevent the enemy fighters from advancing closer to their defensive perimeter. The rocky terrain provided good cover, but they were vastly outnumbered and running critically low on ammunition. Each shot had to count, because there would be no resupply until rescue forces could reach them. Sarah discovered she had an unexpected talent for military communications. Her calm voice and clear thinking helped coordinate complex information flows between multiple parties. She was simultaneously relaying tactical updates to Colonel Hayes, providing encouragement to Thompson's team, and helping analyze potential rescue scenarios based on real-time battlefield information. The most critical moment came at 3:30 a.m., when Thompson reported that enemy fighters had breached their outer defensive line. His team was forced to fall back to a smaller cluster of rocks, reducing their field of fire but improving their defensive positions. 2 of his men were wounded but still fighting effectively. They had perhaps 30 minutes of ammunition remaining at their current rate of consumption. Sarah found herself making decisions that went far beyond her role as a communications operator. When Thompson asked for advice about potential breakout routes, she studied maps and coordinated with intelligence officers to provide tactical recommendations. Her barbershop had maps spread across every surface, with officers marking enemy positions and potential escape corridors based on information she was relaying from the battlefield. The breakthrough came when Sarah suggested using her radio to coordinate with a reconnaissance drone that was still operational despite the communication problems. The drone could provide real-time intelligence about enemy positions and movements, giving Thompson's team crucial information for their defensive efforts. Her grandfather's old radio became the link that allowed the drone operator to communicate tactical intelligence. directly to the trapped SEALs Thompson's team used this intelligence to execute a brilliant tactical maneuver. They identified a gap in the enemy's assault formation and concentrated their remaining firepower on a single point, creating confusion and forcing the attackers to reorganize their approach. This bought them precious time, but everyone knew it was only a temporary reprieve. As dawn approached, Sarah was exhausted but determined to maintain communications until rescue forces could reach Thompson's position. She had been awake for over 20 hours, coordinating between multiple parties and providing vital support to 7 men fighting for their lives. Her small barber shop had become the lifeline connecting the trapped SEAL team to their potential salvation. The sandstorm began clearing at 4:45 a.m., just as Thompson reported that his ammunition was nearly exhausted. His team had fought brilliantly throughout the night, but they could not hold their position much longer against such overwhelming numbers. Everything now depended on rescue forces reaching them before the enemy fighters launched their final assault. Sarah prepared for what she knew would be the most critical hour of the entire ordeal. Rescue helicopters were preparing to launch as soon as visibility improved enough for safe flying. Thompson's team needed to hold their position for just a little longer, and Sarah would be their constant voice of support and coordination until help finally arrived. The rescue helicopters lifted off at 5:23 a.m. as the first rays of sunlight pierced through the clearing sandstorm. Sarah watched from her barbershop window as 2 Apache attack helicopters and a medical evacuation bird disappeared over the eastern hills. Her radio crackled with Thompson's voice, reporting that enemy fighters were massing for what appeared to be their final assault on his team's position. Sarah had become the critical coordinator for the most complex rescue operation Camp Wilson had ever attempted. She was simultaneously communicating with Thompson's team, the incoming helicopter crews, ground support units, and Colonel Hayes's command staff. Her grandfather's shortwave radio had become the hub connecting all these moving pieces in a desperate race against time. Thompson's situation was becoming impossible. His team was down to their last few rounds of ammunition, and the enemy fighters had moved so close that grenades were landing within feet of their defensive positions. 2 of his men were wounded and needed immediate medical attention. The rocky terrain that had protected them all night was now becoming a trap, with no clear escape routes available. The Apache helicopters arrived first, their powerful engines thundering across the valley as they engaged enemy positions with devastating precision. Sarah relayed targeting information from Thompson's team to the helicopter crews, helping them identify where friendly forces were located and where the most dangerous threats needed to be eliminated. Her communication skills had become essential for preventing friendly fire incidents during the chaotic battle. The attack helicopter's arrival changed everything. Enemy fighters who had been advancing confidently on the SEAL's position suddenly found themselves under intense aerial assault. Rocket pods and chain guns tore through their formations, forcing them to scatter and seek cover. For the first time in hours, Thompson reported that the pressure on his team was decreasing significantly, but the rescue operation was far from over. The medical evacuation helicopter needed a safe landing zone to extract Thompson's wounded men, and enemy fighters were still present throughout the valley. Sarah found herself coordinating a complex dance of aircraft movements, ground fire, and tactical positioning that required split-second timing and perfect communication. Thompson made a crucial decision that demonstrated his leadership and tactical brilliance. Rather than waiting passively for extraction, he organized his team for an aggressive breakout toward a better landing zone 500 meters away. This would put them in the open for several minutes, but it would also give the rescue helicopters a much safer approach route. Sarah coordinated this dangerous movement with all parties involved. She relayed Thompson's plan to the helicopter crews, provided real-time updates on enemy positions from the drone operator, and maintained constant communication with the SEAL team as they moved across open ground under fire. Her calm voice became the steady thread connecting all these elements during the most dangerous phase of the rescue. The breakout was successful but costly. Thompson's team reached the alternate landing zone, but one more operator was wounded during the movement. They were now down to 4 fully effective fighters, with 3 wounded men who needed immediate medical evacuation. The enemy fighters were regrouping and moving toward their new position, setting up for another assault. The medical helicopter, pilot made a heroic decision to attempt a landing despite ongoing enemy fire. Sarah coordinated with the Apache crews to provide maximum suppressive fire during the critical moments when the evacuation bird would be most vulnerable. Her communication had to be perfect, because any mistake could result in disaster for all parties involved. As the medical helicopter touched down in a storm of dust and gunfire, Sarah realized that her role as Camp Barber had evolved into something she never could have imagined. She had become the communication lifeline for one of the most dramatic rescue operations in recent military history, and the next few minutes would determine whether Thompson's team would make it home alive. The medical helicopter was on the ground for exactly 97 seconds, but those seconds felt like hours to Sarah as she coordinated the most dangerous phase of the rescue operation. Through her radio, she could hear the chaos of battle as Thompson's team loaded their wounded teammates while Apache gunships provided covering fire against enemy fighters who were desperately trying to prevent the extraction. Thompson's voice remained calm and professional even in these final critical moments. He directed his men with precision, ensuring that the wounded were secured first while the remaining operators maintained defensive positions around the helicopter. Sarah relayed updates between the aircraft crews and ground forces, helping coordinate suppressive fire that kept enemy fighters from advancing during the vulnerable loading process. The moment the last SEAL was aboard, the medical helicopter lifted off under intense fire. Sarah watched from her barbershop window as tracer rounds lit up the dawn sky, but the pilot's skill and the Apache crew's covering fire allowed the evacuation bird to climb safely above the effective range of enemy weapons. For the first time in over 12 hours, she allowed herself to believe that all 7 men would make it home alive. But the rescue was not complete yet. The medical helicopter needed to reach Camp Wilson's medical facility as quickly as possible to treat the wounded operators. Sarah coordinated with the base medical team, relaying information about the injuries so doctors could prepare for immediate treatment upon arrival. Her grandfather's radio continued to be the vital communication link, ensuring that every detail was handled properly. Thompson and his remaining team members were extracted by the second helicopter 15 minutes later. The Apache gunships had successfully suppressed most enemy resistance, allowing for a much smoother pickup of the remaining personnel. Sarah heard Thompson's voice one final time as his helicopter departed the valley, confirming that all personnel were accounted for and expressing gratitude for the communication support that had helped save their lives. The helicopters landed at Camp Wilson at 6:47 a.m., bringing an end to the longest night in the base's history. Sarah finally allowed herself to step outside her barbershop as medical teams rushed to treat the wounded SEALs. She was exhausted, emotionally drained, but overwhelmed with relief that the rescue operation had succeeded, despite seemingly impossible odds. Lieutenant Commander Thompson sought her out personally after being debriefed by Colonel Hayes. Standing in her small barbershop, surrounded by the maps and radio equipment that had coordinated his team's rescue, he thanked her for providing the communication lifeline that had kept his men connected to hope during their darkest hours. Her calm voice and professional coordination had been as important as the helicopters and firepower in ensuring their survival. The 3 wounded operators made full recoveries over the following weeks. Sarah visited them daily in the medical facility, where they shared stories about the battle and expressed amazement at how a Camp Barber had become their communication lifeline during the most dangerous night of their lives. The bonds formed during those 12 hours of crisis would last far beyond their military service. Colonel Hayes submitted Sarah for a commendation recognizing her extraordinary contribution to the rescue operation. Her actions had demonstrated that heroism comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most important role in a military operation might be played by someone who never expected to be anywhere near combat. Her grandfather's old radio and her calm professionalism had helped save 7 lives. Sarah returned to her normal routine as Camp Barber, but everything had changed. Soldiers throughout Camp Wilson now understood that her small shop represented much more than just haircuts and conversation. It had become a symbol of how ordinary people can rise to extraordinary challenges when their fellow service members' lives depend on their courage and competence. Months later, when Sarah finally returned home to Texas, she brought with her stories that seemed almost impossible to believe. The quiet barber who had joined the military for a simple support role had become the communication hero of one of the most dramatic rescue operations in recent military history, proving that sometimes the most unlikely people make the biggest difference when it matters most.